Hello, everybody. Welcome to this ASIL event on gender justice and the United States. We're excited to host this event on Human Rights Day. I'm Nienke Grossman, professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law and co-director of its Center for International and Comparative Law. Christina Bahari and Carrie Bettinger-Lopez and I are co-chairs of the Advancing Gender Justice signature topic at ASIL. We're also assisted by three associates from Foley Hoag, Eva Treves, Julia Padiano Melon, and Maria Camila Rincon, who are on the call with us today and will be leading Q&A later in our discussion. We're also grateful for and want to note the participation, time, and advice of a steering committee consisting of 14 academics, government advisors, advisors to NGOs, and others. I'll now turn it over to Christina for a few more introductory remarks.
Morning, everyone. Carrie, Nienke, and I are very excited to welcome you to this first virtual event of ASIL's signature topic, which is on advancing gender justice. As Nienke mentioned, it is especially fitting to host our kickoff event today in commemoration of Human Rights Day. It also marks the culmination of the 16-day campaign to end gender-based violence. In terms of the signature topic, it will last approximately 2 years, and it aims to spark and advance conversations, dialogue, and engagement with what it means to achieve gender justice. As well, it aims to identify areas of convergence and divergence, as well as the hurdles to achieving full and meaningful participation of women in all their diversity in various spaces of international lawmaking. And I'll turn it back over to Nienke now.
Thank you. After significant conversation about what this signature topic could look like, and in consultation with the steering committee and ASIL staff, we hope that this signature topic initiative will help us to create a constructive space for real dialogue with an emphasis on listening and exchange. We're planning a series of events and discussions both within and beyond ASIL, and we hope to memorialize the signature topics activities through a space on ASIL's website with videos, blog posts, and possibly a white paper. We hope you will participate in the initiative. We're inviting you to participate in the initiative, and we welcome you to reach out to any of us with thoughts or ideas, or if you just want to help out. Now, we're happy to turn over the microphone to Carrie Bettinger-Lopez, who, as we already mentioned, is a co-chair of the Signature Topic Initiative and will be moderating the discussion. Carrie is a professor of law, faculty chair of the Human Rights Program, and director of the Human Rights Clinic at the University of Miami School of Law. She founded that clinic in 2011. From 2021 to 2024, she served as a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Justice and the White House Gender Policy Council. From 2015 to 2017, she served in the Obama-Biden administration as the White House advisor on violence against women and senior advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. Professor Bettinger-Lopez focuses on gender-based violence, racial justice, and immigrants' rights in domestic and international forums. Thank you again to everybody for being here, and we're really excited about this conversation.
Thanks, Nienke, and greetings, everyone. We're so excited to have this kickoff conversation for the Gender Justice Initiative and Signature Topic Initiative, and very excited to welcome our special guests and speakers, as well as some amazing participants who are participating, and we look forward to your questions and answers, and giving you answers. So my name is Carrie Bettinger-Lopez, as Nienke said. And I'm going to give some framing remarks for the conversation and then turn it over to our speakers. So as we approach this change in the administration and inevitably a shift in the priorities of gender justice, we felt like it was a good time to take stock of the last 4 years, both to examine how the Biden-Harris administration has approached gender justice in both global and domestic spaces, and to look toward the agenda of the incoming Trump administration. So we've invited these 3 amazing speakers to discuss some timely questions in this space. Some of the themes we'll be exploring in our conversation today include what the areas were that the Biden administration, where they had synergies with or divergence from past administrations' law and policy priorities regarding gender justice. We want to examine contentious issues that the Biden administration faced in relation to gender justice. We'll be examining the accomplishments of the Biden-Harris administration and also what was left on the table at the end of 4 years. And finally, some thoughts on what we should expect from the incoming Trump administration. Myself, as someone who has straddled domestic and global gender justice work, and I've tried whenever possible to connect those dots, I just wanted to offer a word on the important reasons why I think we should be examining the connections between domestic and global issues in the gender justice arena. So first, just to kind of offer this idea of bidirectionality, that during the Biden administration, in my experience and my observations, international law and policy has informed domestic policy and vice versa much more than in past administrations. And the first ever national plan to end gender-based violence, which was released last year by the White House, is a good example here. And that plan was deeply informed by consultations with other countries, with similar national plans, as well as international organizations. And it cites to international treaties and principles. And it was developed by domestic policymakers in close consultation with colleagues at the State Department and USAID, just really showing kind of this domestic global interaction. And finally, just to kind of make the point about the ways in which US domestic law and policy informs developments globally. I want to point, for example, to the Violence Against Women Act, our national legislation that has historically served as a model for law and policy developments in other countries. And we want to examine today, for example, the effect that the Dobbs decision in the US, for example, has on reproductive rights domestically and globally. And in terms of our US foreign policy, and how it affects our authority to speak on those issues. So these are important issues for the incoming administration. So I wanted to offer some of those framing thoughts. Now I'm going to be introducing our stellar speakers. First, I'll begin with Professor Catherine Powell, who is the Eunice Carter Distinguished Research Scholar Professor of Law at Fordham Law School. Catherine served as the White House Gender Policy Council Senior Advisor on Gender-Based Violence during 2024. And in the Obama administration, she served as the White House National Security Council Director of Human Rights, as well as a senior advisor in the State Department in the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Office. Next, Suzanne Goldberg is a senior advisor to the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights at the U.S. State Department, where she also serves as a senior advisor and legal expert for the Special Envoy to advance human rights of LGBTQI persons. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights from 2021 to mid-2023, and she's currently on public service leave from Columbia Law School faculty. And last but certainly not least is Akila Radhakrishnan, who is an international human rights lawyer and gender justice expert. Akila currently serves as a strategic legal advisor for gender justice at the Atlantic Council's Strategic Litigation Project. She previously served as the president and legal director of the Global Justice Center, leading its work to achieve gender equality and human rights. Akila has led the development of groundbreaking legal work on gender justice, including abortion access in conflict, the role that gender plays in genocide, and codifying the concept of gender apartheid. So now I'm going to kind of lay out the specific questions that we're going to be offering to the panelists. We'll have 2 rounds of questions, and our goal is having a robust discussion, offering different perspectives. So and following these questions, we'll have approximately 10 to 12 minutes for Q&A. So please do offer your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so just to kind of set the table in terms of our framing questions, and by the way, you can see that our colleagues at ASIL are kindly putting several links in the chat that our panelists will be referencing during the conversation. So just to, again, set the table for the Q&A. The first round of questions, I'll be asking our panelists about the work that they have done to enhance gender justice over the past 4 years, as well as the challenges and setbacks that they have faced. And then second, I'll be asking our panelists some questions about their thoughts on the future of U.S. gender justice priorities in law, policy, and foreign assistance. Are there areas of convergence between the Biden administration's gender justice work over the past 4 years? And what are the priorities of the incoming Trump administration? What are the areas where you see the risk of regression or divergence in priorities? What does the future hold for U.S. engagement in gender justice issues on the global and domestic stage? Okay, so with that framing, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine Powell. Catherine, I'd like to ask you kind of in the realm of that first round of questions about the Gender Policy Council, which was established by President Biden to advance gender equity and equality in both domestic and foreign policy development and implementation. Can you speak a bit about the range of issues and communities that the Gender Policy Council focused on, and what were its primary efforts to enhance gender justice? Also, could you speak about some of the challenges and areas of unfinished business?
Thank you so much, Carrie. I'm so honored to join you and the other panelists and everybody here in the webinar. Thanks to you, Ninka and Christine, for launching this special initiative on advancing gender justice, and a special shout out to Carrie, who's a former student and a colleague and a cherished friend. Having worked in the Gender Policy Council for the first half of this year, so I came in year 4 of the Biden-Harris administration, I'd be happy to talk about the achievements as well as the unfinished business. And sorry if you hear sirens in the background, I'm sitting here in Manhattan. But there's always much more we can do. By way of background, the Gender Policy Council was created against the backdrop of the Obama-era White House Council on Women and Girls, which probably many of you remember Valerie Jarrett headed with an assist from her deputy, Tina Chin. And because Valerie already had a full-time job as head of the Office of Public Engagement, the work of the White House Council on Women and Girls was constituency-facing. Those of us who worked in various policy shops at the time, as Carrie mentioned, I worked in the National Security Council as Director for Human Rights and the Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights. Many of us helped staff the White House Council on Women and Girls, but they had no full-time policy staff. Fast forward to the Biden-Harris administration, the Gender Policy Council was the brainchild of 2 of my Obama-era colleagues, Jen Klein and Rachel Vogelstein, who realized the White House needed full-time policy experts focused on gender equality. So the Gender Policy Council, or GPC, is different from the Obama-era White House Council on Women and Girls in at least 2 important respects. First, it's primarily a policy shop, on par with the National Security Council and the Domestic Policy Council. Yes, the GPC meets with constituencies, advocates, and people from impacted communities at various intersections, but its staff and work are deeply engaged in substantive policy. Second, rather than its substance and title focused on women and girls, the GPC is focused on gender more broadly, a recognition that at least since the 2020 Bostock Supreme Court decision, sex discrimination covers discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And long before Bostock, gender equality advocates, we've embraced a much more capacious understanding of gender. Further, gender equality should be a concern for men and boys, not only because many men and boys have women and girls in their lives and benefit, for example, from pay equity from their spouses or moms, for example, especially Black women who are disproportionately female-headed, but also because just as gender can be a straitjacket for women and girls in terms of the way we're expected to perform, and there's stereotypes that limit our opportunities, so too can it be a straitjacket for men and boys. And a petri dish for toxic masculinity and limit self-expression and self-realization. So what's so unique about the Gender Policy Council is it works across the domestic international divide, which is extraordinarily rare in the White House and across government more broadly. Like Carrie, my training is in both civil rights and human rights, and the GPC is one of the few places I work where these linkages between human rights at home and human rights abroad is effectively bridged. In terms of achievements, the GPC is organized around three pillars: strengthening women's economic security, defending reproductive freedom, and ending gender-based violence. Let me just tick off a few of the achievements and happy to pick up more in discussion. In terms of strengthening women's economic security and economic justice, the GPC helped achieve the lowest women's unemployment rate in 70 years, helped narrow the gender pay gap, lift the burden of student debt, life-changing as women carry nearly 2/3 of all student loan debt, support women-owned small businesses, signing the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act into law to help safeguard against workplace discrimination, supported global efforts to empower women economically, including investments to address the digital gender gap, invested in investments for affordable, high-quality childcare, long-term care for adults, supporting family caregivers, raised wages and quality for care workers themselves. The President's FY 2025 budget also proposed to establish a national comprehensive paid family leave and medical leave program. In terms of defending reproductive rights, since Roe v. Wade, Biden has signed executive orders to protect access to reproductive health care and contraception. And we all know the phenomenal Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar successfully defended FDA approval of mifepristone for medical abortion and the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, EMTALA. In terms of GBV, I'll just say that, of course, gender-based violence is a cornerstone of President Biden's career, having signed the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, in 1994, an anniversary we just celebrated this past September, 30-year anniversary. Having adopted a global strategy to end gender-based violence in 2012 under Obama, Biden updated that and launched a national plan to end gender-based violence in 2023, as Carrie mentioned, and which Carrie was instrumental in designing. VAWA has been reauthorized several times with all-time high increased funding in 2022 and extended protections to address Indigenous women and women of color who may be reluctant to report gender-based violence. The administration also stood up a White House task force to address online harassment and abuse, to keep guns out of the hands of abusers, Title IX regulations, which I think Suzanne will discuss, and ensuring stronger protections for subsidized housing for survivors, as well as international protections to address conflict-related sexual violence, trafficking, and immigration. Carrie, let me pause here, and I'm happy to talk also about the challenges ahead and the unfinished business in the discussion moving forward.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Catherine. That you took us on a little tour de force of the past 4 years. Okay, I'm going to turn to Suzanne now to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the areas and accomplishments that Catherine mentioned. So Catherine, you previously served in the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, working on domestic law and policy, and you played a key role in drafting the very comprehensive Title IX rule focused on sex discrimination in education settings. You now work on foreign policy in your current role as senior advisor on LGBTQI rights at the U.S. State Department. And your work connects with foreign policy and foreign assistance, gender and LGBTQI plus priorities of both the Global Women's Initiative's Office at State, as well as USAID. So could you talk a little bit about the work that you've done on enhancing gender justice over the past 4 years across these offices? And so also, could you talk about some of the biggest challenges and the things left on the table? Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you to everybody who has had a hand in organizing this. I'm very excited for the Gender Focus project that is launching, and we'll be looking forward to digging in when I return to my post in academia in around the time of the inauguration. Okay, so thank you for the question. The headline, I think, just in the big picture, is that this has been an extraordinary 4 years. And when we think about the world in terms of the work that I've been focused on here at the State Department, LGBTQI issues and human rights, and more generally gender justice, it has been a time of some real progress that we couldn't have even imagined, and also just tremendous and sometimes devastating challenges and backlash to progress that has been made. Certainly, I'll start off in the State Department LGBTQI plus focus and then expand out. And of course, the work of this Office of the Special Envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQI plus persons builds on the inaugural Special Envoy. The current Special Envoy is Jessica Stern, who's been doing a tremendous job. Her work builds on the tremendous work of Special Envoy Randy Barry under the leadership of Secretary Hillary Clinton, who first said on the world stage, gay rights are human rights in 2011. And I think that was quite a significant sort of framing point that this administration has worked from and built upon. We could spend hours. In the interest of time, I'll just share a few highlights and lowlights. And I'll point colleagues here toward the piece that is in the chat, linked in the chat, that Jessica Stern and I wrote on why LGBTQI issues matter for U.S. foreign policy. So the broader context is the Special Envoy's office, like many offices at state, works with U.S. embassies and civil society activists and human rights defenders in nearly every country around the world to provide support, strategy, high visibility, low visibility behind the scenes work, likewise with multilateral organizations and mechanisms and others, including international financial institutions. Again, big picture, what's happened in the last 4 years? We've seen decriminalization of same-sex relations in 7 countries, most recently in Mauritius and in Dominica and in Namibia, although that is on appeal. We've also seen marriage equality gain traction in 4 countries, Liechtenstein, Greece, Thailand, and Mexico. And even the U.S. Congress passed the Respect for Marriage Act in 2022, codifying marriage equality across the country in statute. We've also seen, though, a devastating spread of anti-LGBTQI plus laws, including repression of civil society organizations, often at the start or alongside broader closures of civil society spaces, and new or strengthened criminalization of the so-called conduct of LGBTQI plus persons, and even the very existence. And this too sometimes comes alongside or ahead, slightly ahead of profound attacks on women and girls and gender justice and equality and really life generally. I'll give one specific example, which is as folks here may know, Uganda enacted the Anti-Homosexuality Act. A couple of years ago, it authorizes the death penalty for so-called serial offenders and a 20-year prison sentence for the, quote, promotion of homosexuality. President Biden quickly condemned the AHA, the Anti-Homosexuality Act, as a tragic violation of universal human rights, and then directed the interagency across the government to take many different actions. And we had a truly unprecedented coordination, including everything from a business advisory and updated U.S. travel advisories and country information pages, which might not sound like a lot here, but it is information on which many people rely to think about whether to travel and how to travel and whether to conduct business. The U.S. expanded visa restrictions to include those repressing vulnerable populations, including LGBTQI plus persons, supported the World Bank's decision to pause Uganda's access to new funds. We're currently engaging on appropriate mitigation measures, imposed sanctions on the head of the prison service for widespread violations of human rights, including LGBTQI plus persons. And President Biden also determined that Uganda did not meet the threshold eligibility requirements of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, on the basis of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. So when we think about what a difference an administration may make, these should be nonpartisan issues. We know there's been a tremendous focus of attention, resources, time, and energy here. The administration has also taken the lead speaking out against a wide range of similar kind of repressive measures. Just one quick example, last November 2023, Secretary Blinken issued a strong condemnation of the Russia Supreme Court decision to designate the so-called international LGBT movement as extremist. And so the US has, in that space, as well as in multilateral spaces, taken significant leadership on these issues. I know I don't have a lot of time. I'll just say we've expanded work on refugees. USAID also importantly recognizing the need for inclusive development so that all eligible persons have access to services and programs being offered, released a blueprint policy to support LGBTQI plus inclusive development and has begun that implementation through a variety of projects. If you haven't looked at that and you're interested in development issues, I encourage you to look at their strategy. We've seen a growth in funding through PEPFAR, through the Global Equality Fund, other emergency funds, to support LGBTQI plus civil society, to support emergency response, and of course on the gender justice side as well. Lots more. I just want to put a quick plug in for some work I've been doing related to law enforcement training and capacity building to take more steps to reduce the persistent and pervasive official violence, including by law enforcement and security forces toward LGBTQI persons and other marginalized populations. Okay, 1 minute on the work, some of the work of our the State Department's Office for Global Women's Issues has been doing tremendous work on women, peace, and security, and there's lots of reporting there on that. Supported women's leadership in peace processes that we may hear some about. We've heard about the global strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. Also tremendous work related to human trafficking, child marriage, relationship violence, Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative. And now I probably have 60 seconds to talk about domestic policy. And we'll say that one of the things President Biden did very early, day one of the administration, issued an executive order on combating sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination and other harms, and then directed the Department of Education to consider how Title IX could enable safe access to schools free from sex discrimination for all students. When I was at the Department of Education, we of course took that directive very seriously, launched many efforts, which I would encourage you to use your favorite search engine to find, but ultimately also issued new regulations under Title IX, clarifying that the protections under Title IX's prohibition on sex discrimination in federally funded education programs and activities, including clear, effective protections against sex-based harassment in schools, making clear what schools' obligations are to respond to all forms of gender-based violence, as well as to protect students against sexual orientation discrimination, gender identity discrimination, pregnancy discrimination, and much more. Those regulations are in litigation right now, so I will just encourage you to take a look online for more information. There's so much more to be said, but thanks for the opportunity to share this very tips of some of the waves.
Thank you, Suzanne. Another tour de force of both global and domestic spaces. Thank you. Okay, Akila, we're so excited to welcome you as well. And I'd like to ask you about some areas involving your work on gender apartheid, most prominently in Afghanistan, but also in other parts of the world. You also have deep experience in global reproductive rights. So from an NGO perspective, I'm wondering, can you speak about this work over the last 4 years? What are your praises and critiques of the Biden administration's gender justice agenda?
Thank you, Carrie, and really thank you so much to having me on this discussion that I think is really vital in this moment in time. So I will start with Afghanistan and then touch on a couple of the other issues as well. So thank you again. So, on Afghanistan, in the Afghanistan Withdrawal Agreement negotiated by the Trump administration, but executed by the Biden administration, we saw that women's rights were negotiated away from under them. And in the wake of these actions by the US government, it has resulted in the formation of the largest women's rights crisis in the world, where women are being erased from society, denied every right, with their very voices legally silenced in public or even in conversation with each other. So we have seen the Biden administration take really positive and good positions in the wake of this crisis, such as supporting the evacuation of women's human rights defenders who are targeted or likely to be targeted by the Taliban, including activists, lawyers, and judges. We've also seen the administration say the right things about the need to center women and women's rights in multilateral discussions around the future of Afghanistan, including in the Doha talks. And we've also seen them support accountability efforts, including documentation, as well as efforts to codify the crime of gender apartheid, which is the term that Afghan women have been using to define their own experience and have called for and created a global campaign for its recognition and codification. And so these are all positive steps that we've seen from the administration. There have, though, often been, and you asked for the NGO perspective, so there have been gaps in this rhetoric. And for example, in July, we saw the US lament the decision to exclude women from the table and women's rights from the agenda in the Doha 3 talks in June, but they also failed to draw a red line on this and joined an international chorus of actors telling Afghan women to yet again be patient as the world negotiates their future without them. And, I think that on Afghanistan, it's been a little bit of a mixed legacy, but we have been generally happy to see where the US government is. And I think that as we look forward, there are some hopes that the USG will take some key actions in the time remaining right now to better protect the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan as we prepare for the transition. So one really key one is I mentioned that the Biden administration was really laudable in helping to evacuate women and girls. One thing that remains on the table for many of them is actually what the resettlement process and their papers look like. Many remain in limbo, and we are calling on the administration to expedite the resettlement process to ensure their safety and their ability to remain in the United States. We've also, Afghan advocates are also calling to make the Office of the Special Envoy for Women and Human Rights in Afghanistan a permanent entity to ensure continuity in the prioritization of women's rights in all ongoing discussions that the United States government engages in on Afghanistan. And the last one is about bookmarking funding now to support women's rights organizations in their fight for justice and accountability, including the documentation of the ongoing harms in the country. I also want to zoom out a little bit from Afghanistan and talk a little bit more generally about justice and accountability, because so much of the leadership on justice and accountability is interconnected. And there we've seen the US government be a strong ally across efforts to ensure justice for crises around the world. Well, perhaps bar one, which I will get to. The USG, particularly under the leadership of the Office of Global Criminal Justice, led by its first female ambassador, has been a champion of gender justice and the global system and mechanisms and processes that support justice and accountability. In addition, the US was a champion of moving the draft Crimes Against Humanity Treaty negotiations, which presents the most ripe opportunity to codify gender apartheid, and which the USG has also shown support towards other gender justice priorities including ensuring an inclusive and intersectional understanding of the definition of gender, which connects to some of the work that Suzanne has been talking about that the US has been taking leadership on globally on LGBTQI+ rights. However, I would be remiss in discussing work on justice and accountability without addressing the situation in Gaza, a genocide that has a multidimensional gendered aspects and impacts, which will likely define this administration's legacy and not in a positive way. The failure to apply mandated assessments related to humanitarian aid while providing arms to Israel. Rhetoric that has maligned the work of the International Criminal Court following the issuance of arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, which it should be noted are based on the same jurisdictional premise as an arrest warrant for Putin that was lauded by the US government. And repeated vetoes at the UN Security Council will all undermine this administration's legacy on these issues. So I do feel like it's important that we address what some of these concerns are as we move forward. And finally, you mentioned reproductive rights. So on that, I'm going to focus on global actions related to sexual reproductive rights. From the start, the administration took laudable actions to undo and fix some of the actions taken by the previous administration that deeply undermined access to sexual and reproductive health care around the world. Almost immediately, the Biden administration withdrew the expanded global gag rule, withdrew from the Geneva Consensus, a document spearheaded by the Trump administration at the United Nations that declared that there's no international human right to abortion in blatant disregard of the current status of human rights law, and reinitiated funding to UNFPA and the World Health Organization. These were essential actions that sought to mitigate the harms of previous administrations. However, there are, again, issues left on the table. The administration has not taken up longstanding calls to clarify and limit the application of the Helms Amendment, which is the legislative basis of the global gag rule. Advocates have called for work to clarify permissible activities under the full package of foreign assistance restrictions on abortion, including Helms and Sillinger. This includes, for example, making clear that abortion services can in fact be provided with U.S. foreign assistance funds at a minimum in cases of rape, incest, and life endangerment, including for rape victims and conflict. So there's still time for the administration to act on some of these issues to not only solidify its legacy of the many, many laudable things that Catherine and Suzanne have discussed, but also to make some of these gains a little bit more difficult to undo by subsequent administrations. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. You covered so much ground and very comprehensive. Thank you so much. Great. Okay. We are going to move on to round 2 of our questions. We have about 10 minutes or so for this, and then we will be going to the Q&A. So I want to encourage participants to please put your questions in the Q&A. We, the panelists, can see those questions, and then we'll be able to address them after this next round of questions. So look forward to seeing those. Okay, so on round 2, we're going to kind of move on to the future. We've kind of done a lot focused on kind of the past and the present with some kind of looks toward the future. And now we want to do a little bit of a deeper dive about kind of what's been left on the table, what challenges remain, and where we see things going, as well as kind of, you know, words of wisdom for a gender justice agenda moving forward. So, Catherine, we're going to kick it off with you. If we could pick up where you left off, and talk a little bit more about, as you were saying, what's been left on the table, and also areas that you might see as evergreen, likely to have life beyond any particular administration. Can you also talk about what areas are most vulnerable to change or elimination?
Sure. So in terms of some of the biggest challenges, the Gender Policy Council is very committed and did a ton of work at various intersections of gender with race, with immigration status, sexual orientation, disability. We did a lot on older women. But, you know, sometimes the way bureaucracies are structured, when you have a Gender Policy Council on the one hand and a Domestic Policy Council on the other, and other components that focus on that are responsible for racial justice or immigration policy, just bureaucratically, it can sometimes be difficult to work at those intersections, and it really depends on personnel and awareness. And I can't say enough positive about Jen Klein, the director of the Gender Policy Council, has a real awareness of this. But oftentimes it is very hard because you have to have willing partners, in all the different components. And so I oftentimes found myself, in hallway conversations with my colleagues and other components, and just, being able to work collaboratively across these intersections is sometimes a challenge. I think there's also more that we could do around men and boys. And I had conversations with advocates who work on, for example, work with men and boys, including men and boys of color, in the whole space of violence interruption. I would have wanted to do more work around that had I been there longer. I think in terms of what are the areas that, sort of life beyond this particular administration, and what areas are most vulnerable to change and elimination. Well, we know Project 2025 calls for getting rid of the Gender Policy Council. So I worry that so much of the progress we've made will be stalled, or worse, turned back. And acknowledging really the very compelling remarks that Akila has made. I mean, I should say I work mainly on domestic policy this time around than international, though some work on trafficking and immigration that was gender related. But I hope that the broader gender equality movement, including in advocates at home and abroad, and our government partners abroad, can keep the momentum going in terms of the positive achievements. But at the same time, as Janet Halley and other scholars note in their critique of governance feminism, sometimes when we do feminism through government, it loses its radical potential, its potential for, its full emancipatory potential. So my plan was to return to the academy regardless of the outcome of the election this past fall. In fact, I left in July to come back this fall, as my dean told me he needed me back here. But perhaps this is a moment more broadly for all of us to take a step back and determine how to better build a gender equality agenda that is sustainable, that has more support across various communities. And I'm eager to find ways outside of government to do this work with all of you.
Thank you, Catherine. Great. That is a great segue over to Suzanne. So Suzanne, if you could pick up where you left off as well, to talk about what future you see for your office, the Special Envoy's Office for the Human Rights of LGBTQI persons, at the State Department, and also for work more generally to promote gender and LGBTQI plus rights in U.S. foreign policy and foreign assistance in the future, as well as the challenges that lie ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Carrie. And I can build a little bit on some of what Catherine said, and we'll also be brief since I probably took most of my minutes in response to the last question. Jessica Stern, the current special envoy, and I do lay out a lot of our views about these issues in this piece together on foreign policy and LGBTQI plus issues. So again, I'd refer anyone who's interested to that. I think I have two large points I'd like to make, but the headline is that there's a lot of noise on LGBTQI plus persons in the world, and not only noise, but there's a lot of noise that translates into real hostility, into dangerous legislation, into vicious attacks. At the same time, I think my headline is these are nonpartisan issues, and I'll speak specifically about the foreign policy space right now. We see consistently that LGBTQI plus persons and attacks on LGBTQI plus persons are really among the lead canary in the coal mine issues right now. And the canary is telling us that what we see when we see these attacks, legal and official violence, are democratic backsliding, heightened risk of atrocity, heightened risk of corruption, especially, but not only among law enforcement, who see LGBTQI plus people as an easy target. And then the corruption gets tolerated, the extortion, the abuse, the harassment gets tolerated, and that can infect an entire sort of law enforcement or security unit. We therefore see heightened risk of transnational crime and related risk of terrorism when groups are sorry, my camera seems to be moving here. I hope it's working okay. As well as economic instability, risks to public health from from governments creating conditions in which it is not safe for lesbians, gay men, bisexual people, transgender people, intersex people to access health services and more. So these should be nonpartisan issues for the United States. I was at a summit yesterday with LGBTQI plus activists from around the world, and one of the lead concerns they expressed is, where, the United States has really led in this area, not only, and with others, and certainly with our own challenges here. But there's a lot of thinking about what are the mechanisms and what are the many ways in which we can continue to do this work going forward. But to round out my nonpartisan point, I want to share the words of Secretary Blinken at a convening we had in June here at the State Department on LGBTQI plus issues and U.S. foreign policy. And these are Secretary Blinken first quoted President Biden's executive order from day one, stating that with respect to sexual orientation, gender identity, all human beings should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear, no matter who they are or whom they love. And Secretary Blinken went on to say, it's as simple as that. LGBTQI plus rights are human rights, and our government has a responsibility to defend them, to promote them here and everywhere. And then here's really what I think is the core national security point. Upholding these rights is crucial to safeguarding and accelerating our renewal at home. Our ability to stand up for human rights and democracy internationally is also tied to whether we're strong on these fronts here in our own country. So much of what we do, we see the connections between what we're doing and what we're doing at home and how we're doing at home and what we're doing and how we're doing abroad to make your binational point from earlier, Carrie. And then he says it's also profoundly in our national interest and vital to our national security to stand up for LGBTQI plus people around the world. We know the last administration did not fill the role of the special envoy, and this office was empty. And the staff here will be either leaving the administration or moving to other offices. But what we also know is that the work must continue, and one way or another, we will find ways together to continue it.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Great connecting of the dots there. Okay, great. And Akila, now just over to you. We've heard the perspective of current and former U.S. government officials from Catherine and Suzanne, and wondering if you could, again, kind of offer from the NGO perspective, your priority areas for and your expectations of the incoming Trump administration.
Thanks, Carrie. As someone who led a gender justice focused organization during the last administration, I have to say I do come to this moment with a lot of apprehension. I think those 4 years were characterized by quite a lot of difficult actions that were taken by the US government. And as an organization that works globally but is focused in the United States, we certainly did feel the need to, really reflect on what it is that we can do as we're engaging in this, in this space, including, for example, I'm taken back to the time when the US government threatened to veto. I think this was the only time a resolution on women, peace, and security at the Security Council was ever threatened to be vetoed. And it was because there was language reiterating previous Security Council language that related to an affirmation of the need to provide reproductive rights. And so, there's a lot that comes to my mind about what we saw. And so certainly, I think some of the things that we are likely to see are some of the things I discussed that the last Biden administration undid almost immediately, right? We are likely to see almost certainly right at the beginning of the administration a reinstatement of the expanded global gag rule. As well as I think potentially the domestic global gag rule, which, considering the reproductive landscape in the United States since the last time it was instituted under the Trump administration, poses even more harms in the ways in which it may restrict the ability of folks to access care, as because of how limited it's already become in certain states. I also do think that we will see the repeal of funding for institutions such as UNFPA, the WHO, and other UN entities that support human rights work that are antithetical to the administration. And in a world where we see exacerbating crises everywhere, these are going to be devastating for women and girls around the world. And so really, I think we do need to think about how we, as a global gender justice community, strategize to ensure that we are not just mitigating these harms, but really forward thinking about how it is that we don't sometimes go into this back and forth football on global women's rights when US administrations change. We don't see the same level of flip-flopping when governments change in other countries. And so I think that's something for us to also think about now, is how do we try to make these things more sustainable as we go forward, and we don't just rest in some ways when a new administration comes into play. I also do think that perhaps we'll see them picking right back up on the Geneva Conventions and pushing forward global leadership to undermine hard-fought rights in the international arena, declaring abortion to be a human right. We may also see the reinstatement of the Commission on Unalienable Rights, a State Department commission which sought to redefine and narrow the scope of international human rights. And so I think we probably will pick up on some of the strategies we were engaged in previously to try to mitigate these harms, and we may need to also think about what are new ways to try to fight against what may be coming down. I'll just be really brief. There's 2 other things that are definitely on my mind, particularly as it relates to justice and accountability, thinking about the work that's been done on countries like Afghanistan and others. So one is really the possibility of shrinking civil society space, including through the potential passage and signing by the president of the Stop Terror Financing and Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act, which we've seen pass the House of Representatives already, and which, civil society has expressed a lot of concerns about how it can be used as a tool to curb free speech, censor nonprofit media and outlets, and target political opponents, and punish groups working on disfavored issues such as LGBTQI rights, abortion rights, as well as conflicts and situations that are disfavored by the administration. And the last thing is, I am worried about the undermining of support for institutions that can deliver gender justice, including, for Afghanistan. For example, we've seen that the International Criminal Court has recently confirmed that arrest warrants are soon to be coming down for the situation in Afghanistan, something that's incredibly important to fight the impunity of the Taliban. However, we also have, we've seen language and rhetoric that there may be sanctions imposed on the International Criminal Court. And so these can really undermine and act as a regressive force around the work on justice and accountability. And finally, I've highlighted the support that the current administration has shown for taking a gender progressive view to the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty negotiations, which will be happening under the new administration. And considering the positions that have been articulated across the board, we do have concerns that the US will be allying themselves and be a regressive force during the negotiations of this treaty rather than the positive force that they have currently been to date. So I will maybe stop there. I know we have questions in the audience as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Akila, that was great. And thank you for also kind of wrapping in and addressing one of the questions that we received about the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. I am going to turn it over right now to my colleague, Yulia Paranou-Melon from Foley Hoag, who's going to now moderate the Q&A for the remaining minutes of our discussion. So thanks again. Go ahead, Yulia.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you to the panelists for this incredibly insightful discussion. There have been a few questions coming in the Q&A. I apologize in advance if we aren't going to be able to get to all of them. But let me start with a question, I guess maybe for Catherine and Carrie, if you'd like to weigh in as well, that would be great, which is, will the US ever become a party to CEDAW? Why or why not? And Catherine, if you could maybe speak a little bit to that question, that would be great.
Sure. So this falls in the category of what's left on the table. And I worked on the CEDAW ratification package in the Obama era, sort of refreshing it. It had gone through 2 cycles of ratification hearings and had failed to get out of committee. And in the Obama era, we were able to scrub the Reservation Understanding Declaration package to take out the combat bans, since Obama had dropped the combat ban on women. When I worked in the White House, we sent the Disability Convention to the Hill, and that was one where we had bipartisan support, unlike CEDAW, where we had, John McCain and, I remember hosting Bob Dole at the White House. We had wounded warriors, we had veterans, and then other Republican leaning constituencies like the Chamber of Commerce realized that it would help American businesses to compete abroad if we could, the gold standard of the American Disabilities Act, if we could, have that be the global standard, because the Disability Convention mirrors so much of what we were doing domestically. But even with that treaty, we failed, right? It takes a supermajority of 2/3, and the hurdle is just so high. And so Carrie may have more information on, recent efforts, but, of course, there are state and local efforts to embrace CEDAW-like standards, like in San Francisco, to build grassroots support. But I think this is an area where clearly we need to do more work to build support for people beyond feminists to understand the importance of this treaty.
Yeah, I would just say that, of course, there's a large global movement to try to get an optional protocol to CEDAW, or, prior to that, even a standalone violence against women treaty that would, focus on violence against women. And both of those efforts have met with both strong support from a lot of women's activist movements worldwide, but have hit a lot of roadblocks, as many folks who are participating in this webinar, I'm sure, can attest to. So kind of the global efforts, both to kind of get an optional protocol on violence against women, as well as for the U.S. ratification of CEDAW, sometimes feel insurmountable. I would say, to the point that Catherine made, that in the US, I think in this incoming administration, with the administration in particular, that state and local efforts are going to be increasingly important to just think about realizing women's human rights and gender justice. And so one of my big takeaways from this conversation and from the past 4 years is that I think a lot of great work has been done in the federal government that creates a blueprint for others in the country at other subnational levels of government, as well as the private sector, to take and modify and adapt to particular local circumstances. And so, for example, the CEDAW Cities movement that Catherine referred to is now kind of having a reimagination and reinvigoration. It's about to be relaunched as something called CEDAW Rising, and I just learned about this, but heard that one of their priority areas will be potentially to have municipalities creating local action plans on gender justice and gender equality that mirror a lot of the work that has been done through the Gender Policy Council and the federal agencies in this administration. So I would say, for people who are interested, stay tuned for that, for kind of CEDAW realization and implementation through through local action and policy making.
Ule, can I just add one
Yes,
quick thing?
please.
I think, and it's really to build on this. I think one thing we need to think about is, I think we all kind of agree it's probably not possible with this administration or this current political climate. But I think one thing that I've thought a lot about CEDAW when I look back at previous US efforts to ratify CEDAW is we've often framed the efforts as something that's for women elsewhere in the world. The importance of the US joining CEDAW for the leadership that it shows elsewhere. And in this moment in time, as we sit in a profound moment of crisis across a range of women's rights in this country, we really need to start, I think, making a case for the ratification of CEDAW and the meaningful implementation of CEDAW for women, girls, LGBTQI, and other gender diverse persons here in the United States. Why that matters, why the standards that have been set by CEDAW, the wins that we've seen gained under CEDAW in other countries, are actually ways that we can think about how we then implement a better system of gender-focused rights here in the United States. So I think there's also a call to all of us to fundamentally shift how we look at the importance of global treaties and how it is that we actually think about the work that the US government funds, or many of us do in other countries, to use these treaties to improve the situation of women's rights and gender justice, actually could be deployed domestically.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you for answering that. We have about a minute left. So as I suspected, we are unfortunately not going to be able to get to all the questions, but there was one more question that I wanted to pose to our panelists, which is why the administration has not yet published the ERA so that it can be formally recognized, and can this be done before this current administration leaves office? So I don't know if I can turn to perhaps Catherine to start us off on this question.
Sure, this is another tough one of the work that remains to be done. And before I joined the White House, I think it was the Office of Legal Counsel did a legal analysis to look at whether the president had authority to demand that the archivist publish the Equal Rights Amendment, though, the whole question of some of the state level adoptions had been after deadlines that were set, back in the 70s. And the Office of Legal Counsel determined that the executive branch doesn't have authority. It's up to Congress. There's no reason why people can't push the White House to revisit that question in the weeks that remain. Fortunately, here in New York, we had a very contested ballot initiative around the Equal Rights Amendment at New York State level, which was fortunately adopted. That's a big victory, and going back to the leadership that state and local governments can play. But there's no reason why this isn't an issue we might raise in the weeks that remain to ask them to revisit that question.
Great. Thank you.
Can I jump in just for one sentence on not the ERA, but this question of convergence with this administration and the next? And I think we've talked a lot about areas where there are stated policies in Project 2025 or elsewhere that do not look to be supportive of gender justice, understood holistically or even sometimes narrowly. At the same time, it is always helpful to remember, and I think to remind the incoming colleagues that discrimination, harassment, abuse, violence based on gender, as well as based on many other characteristics. But since we're focused here on gender, I would say inclusively, or intersectionally across many aspects of the way gender intersects with identity. All of those forms of discrimination, harassment, and abuse are costly. They're inefficient. They do threaten our national security. And if nothing else, it would be helpful to understand it is a helpful reminder from an economic as well as a national security standpoint that to leave these issues underserved puts our country at risk and also creates costs that we really don't need and can't afford to bear.
Thank you. I think that may conclude our Q&A session. I'll turn it back over to Carrie, but thank you all so much for your thoughtful responses and to the participants for your questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Yulia. And I know we are a little bit over time, so I'm going to just thank all of the panelists for a really excellent discussion. I feel like this was a very rich hour that we spent together, and we look forward to continuing these conversations through the ASIL Gender Justice and International Law signature topics. So please, we invite anybody who's participating here to please reach out to us to offer your ideas and suggestions for ways that we can continue these conversations, both in kind of formal ASIL spaces and beyond. We have 2 years to be in listening mode and consolidation mode, and we're really looking forward to that process. I also just want to give a special shout out to Brita and the rest of the ASIL staff who were so instrumental in making this webinar happen on short notice. So thanks to